So as we start this program, I want to introduce someone who flew in from Cairo to be with us today. As the deputy head of Egyptian State Television's English language channel, Nile TV, Shahira Amin had an influential front row seat during the revolutionary uprising in her country. At its height, feeling that the real story wasn't getting out, she voluntarily quit her position in protest. Shahira has been closely following the progress of the parliamentary elections in Egypt and their impact on the spirit of the movement centered in Tahrir Square. Today, we're so privileged to have her join us to hear her story. But before she comes on stage, she brought a video with her that we're about to show. It's of women from Tahrir Square that was shot just a couple of days ago.
Obviously, historically in Egypt, there were some women who would go to protests and would get beaten up alongside men and sexually harassed at times, and they would experience that violence. But it was not until Tahrir in this year that you really saw significant numbers of women taking to the streets, fully participating in this moment of empowerment. And I think the safety that Tahrir created in those days after the violence really gave a new voice and a new platform to a lot of women who felt that they had an equal stake in shaping their country's political future. Women in Egypt have historically been very underrepresented politically, and so that was a bit of a turning point. Since that moment, however, women have felt sidelined from decision-making, from positions of decision-making, from decision-making committees, also the Super-Constitutional Principles Committee, obviously at the very beginning. The Constitutional Amendment Committee at the very beginning included no women. Very few women were appointed to the new government, and there's been no attempt by either the cabinet or the ruling military to prioritize participation of women or encourage participation of women over the past few months. We're now on the eve of parliamentary elections, where because of the fact that the 64-seat quota was dropped and replaced with a requirement that each party list one woman on their party list, we may end up with a parliament that has very few women in it. And without that, we will not be able to address the issues that affect women more broadly in Egypt. Violence against women, an unaddressed issue, discrimination against women in legislation, lack of representation of women in political decision-making. All of these are issues that can only be put on the agenda and fought for, because this is obviously a long-term process, but women have to be present, and right now they're not.
The Egyptian woman has shown that she is very courageous. All of us, women and men, were in Tahrir. I want to tell Egyptian women that if you succeed in achieving your goals, it will not be a victory for women alone. Rather, it'll be a victory for equality, for justice, for the Christians, the Nubians, the Bedouins, and all minority groups, and for the poor. The day we lose will be the day we stop defending our rights.
Voices of two women from Tahrir, and the last one was our first female presidential candidate, Buthaina Kamel. Before that, it was Heba Mourayef, a human rights activist with Human Rights Watch. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. In January this year, it seemed I had it all. I was deputy head of a state-run news channel, Nile TV. And also, I was one of its lead anchors and correspondents, traveling the world, covering major events. And I was a happily divorced mum with two successful grown-up kids. Then the mass uprising broke out on the 25th of January, and I experienced my own little revolution. I resigned on the 2nd of February at the height of the uprising, in protest at state television's coverage of the events in Tahrir. As history was being made just 3 minutes away from the TV building, state television was showing tranquil scenes of the River Nile. I asked for a camera crew to go to Tahrir, and I was told to cover the pro-Mubarak rallies instead. And I was handed press releases from the Interior Ministry that called the revolutionaries criminals, thugs, and foreign agents. I knew it was the Egyptian people out there in Tahrir, an all-inclusive people's movement. And I felt that if I fed the public lies, I would have the blood of these young people on my hands. These were very courageous young activists putting their lives on the line for our freedom, for social justice, for democracy, and for an end to the rampant corruption. I could not betray them, so I headed straight to Tahrir instead of heading to the studio. And I sent my boss an SMS saying, "Forgive me, I'm not coming back. I'm on the side of the people, not the regime." I stayed, thank you. I stayed in Tahrir until the 11th of February, when it was announced that Mubarak was finally stepping down. And I owe this life-changing decision to one man here in the United States. Ted Turner, thank you. In 2001, he invited me to CNN, to the CNN Center in Atlanta for training. And it was a re-education. Those 3 weeks at the CNN headquarters, I learned everything I know about journalistic ethics. And all these years, I worked very hard for a very long time to maintain this image of credibility. And I felt that by staying on, I would be committing career suicide. So thank you, Ted. I wasn't the only woman in Tahrir. The women of Egypt were there, rubbing shoulders with the men. And they weren't just there in their traditional roles. Oh yes, they did conduct security checks at the entrances into and exits out of Tahrir. They distributed food. They nursed and treated the wounded. But they were also there at the podium, chanting, "Mubarak leave." And the men were chanting behind them. Often, Tahrir was a turning point for women's empowerment. For long, women's voices in Egypt had been silenced. Tahrir was a moment for women to regain their dignity and take their rightful place alongside the men. The revolution was about rights, equality, social justice, and liberation for all Egyptians, including the women. So what were things like for women before the revolution? Well, there were small gains that were made over the last 10 to 15 years, like the issuance of a health ministry decree criminalizing female genital cutting. Before the decree, 97% of Egyptian women had been exposed to the harmful practice, a practice that scars women emotionally and physically for life. The rate dropped to 76% after an anti-FGC campaign was launched in villages and remote hamlets. But that figure is still awfully high. I have spoken to village girls and men. The men say they won't marry a girl who hasn't been circumcised because they believe that cutting protects a girl's chastity and preserves the family honor. Girls are afraid that no one will want to marry them, and they succumb to peer pressure. Old habits die hard, and this is a centuries-old tradition. It may take many more years to change the mindset of the men. Then there's the passing on of a mother's nationality to her children if she's married to a non-Egyptian. And the introduction of khula some years ago, giving women the right to divorce their husbands if they are trapped in an unhappy marriage. Previously, it was only the men who could divorce their wives. There are family courts to settle disputes within the family, and more girls are staying on at school rather than dropping out to get married early. But is the picture rosy? No, far from it. Women are lagging behind in the political sphere. They were extremely underrepresented in parliament and in the cabinet. The patriarchal culture has forced them to stay in the shadows and not have a role in the decision-making process. Women were and still are constantly harassed on the streets. even if they're covered up. Often the harassment is verbal. At times it is physical. And in recent years, it has gotten worse. It now includes groping and, in extreme cases, rape. Activists say the phenomena is a kind of protest at women in public life. With few available job opportunities, men see working women as competitors for limited job opportunities, and they vent their anger and frustration on the women. But harassers are getting away with this kind of behavior because many women are ashamed to speak out, and they often blame themselves. They fear it may stigmatize them for life. Female protesters, 17 of them, who underwent virginity tests by a male doctor in the Cairo Museum grounds after they were arrested by the military in Tahrir Square in March, spoke out about their ordeal at a press conference. I broke the story on the virginity tests on CNN at the end of May, after I got the first admission from a senior military general that the tests had been carried out. For 2 months, the military had been denying that these tests had been carried out. The military tried to intimidate me by spreading rumors that I had been summoned by the military prosecutor for investigation. Once the story came out, the general had defended the tests, saying, "These weren't your daughter or mine. These were girls who had camped out in Tahrir." We were afraid they would later accuse us of sexual assault, so we had to prove they weren't virgins anyway. The excuse was worse than the deed itself, as if the tests weren't sexual assault in themselves. I later found out that this was routine procedure in Egypt. Anyone who is arrested or detained is subjected to this kind of humiliation. We were all shocked to hear about Lara Logan being sexually assaulted in Tahrir Square when she was reporting from Cairo. And that wasn't a one-off incident. The same thing has happened again and again with female journalists who got physically assaulted. Women who gathered to celebrate Women's Day on the 8th of March were also subjected to harassment. And more recently, 2 Egyptian-American journalists covering the latest uprising in Tahrir were also beaten, sexually assaulted, arrested, and detained. The media plays a role in reinforcing such attitudes. We often see in films and drama serials stereotypes of men beating their wives for crossing the line. What now in post-revolutionary Egypt? The future is uncertain. It's murky. We are at a crossroads, and we're not sure which way we're heading. We had the revolution for a secular, democratic Egypt. But it looks like the Islamists are taking control of power, and they want Sharia law implemented. This can only mean less rights for women, who are seen as second-class citizens. Not one woman was invited to be part of a committee of wise men drafting constitutional amendments after the revolution. And there's just one woman cabinet minister. She's a holdover from the former government. These are very worrying developments, as women have shown they are a formidable force, and they too now feel they have a stake in their own country. After the revolution, we saw them on the streets, painting the pavements, clearing the garbage off the streets, directing traffic alongside their male counterparts. And they were mobilizing and campaigning rigorously for the parliamentary elections. All my women friends have joined political parties, even though they lack the political expertise. So clearly, the energy is there. The momentum has started. We need to build on what has been started. Women in Egypt are no longer prepared to take a back seat or go back to the shadows. They have found their voice, and they are demanding equal rights. The women of Egypt make up more than half the society. Without their participation, Egypt can never prosper or advance. And women are the future of the new Egypt. They will lead, and the men will follow.